on this site where we see the first ever intentional application of Italian Renaissance design on a significant scale anywhere in Spain. Now then, boys and girls, ladies and gents, how are we doing? Welcome back to the Hispanophiles podcast, the only podcast where... Wait a minute. Antonio Lobato.
¿Quieres saber cuánto vale tu coche?
No, thank you. On today's episode, something a little bit different for you. Recently, during Easter, during Semana Santa, I had the pleasure of taking some time off and going back to what is my spiritual home in this fair country. That is, of course, Seville, Hispalis, the Andalusian capital and the place where I first went to live post-graduation. I visited a bunch of amazing places as well, including the underappreciated and little-known Casa de Pilatos, a 15th and 16th century residential palace in the Old Town that is an amazing blend of architectural styles and designs that tell the story of the social and cultural evolution of Spain during the 16th century. It is remarkable how little known this place is. Everyone knows the Golden Tower in Seville, everyone knows the Real Alcázar, everyone knows the cathedral and the Giralda, but no one seems to know about this absolute gem of a place of interest. So I thought we'll dedicate an episode to righting this wrong, and that's what we're doing today. I'll be taking you on a tour of one of the most exquisite places to visit, in my opinion, in possibly all of Spain. But first, as usual, we need to do the regular features, and today a little bit different. Because Spanish news is also Spanish vocabulary, that's right, we are of course talking about el apagón, the Spanish for the big massive shutdown. Thank you, Skepta. Literally the massive switch off of power that happened last week here in Spain. About 12:33 Central European time in the afternoon, I was at work, I was in the office, all across the Spanish and Portuguese electrical grid. We all lost power for about 7 hours in my case. I think I read that within one day, about 90% of people in the country had their power restored, so it came on in drips and drabs, but it was resolved pretty quickly. We still, at time of recording, don't have a full explanation as to what happened technically. Terrorism or cyber attack was ruled out pretty quickly by the state, but it's still not entirely clear. What is apparent, reading from the Red Eléctrica Española, is that shortly before 12:33 in the afternoon, there were two disconnection events somewhere in the southwest of Spain. What looks like had happened was that there was a sudden mismatch between the input expected and output given from the solar power generation plants, facilities, whatever you want to call them, in the southwest of Spain. It's believed this wasn't a human error, more likely some kind of overlooked programming error gap in the actual system that caused this blackout in this short period of time. Essentially, a massive shift in output from solar, wind, and nuclear plants across the grid, driven by a sudden decline in a very short space of time of the output from solar panels. What happened? Well, maybe a really big pigeon flew over them. I have no idea. It's entirely possible, but nevertheless, so El Apagón, the big massive shutdown in power, is our Spanish news, which is our Spanish vocabulary, something a little bit different today. Let's now move on to the meat and potatoes of this episode and talk about, as I said, what I think is an underappreciated architectural gem in Seville that you definitely need to put on your bucket list of things to visit when you come to Spain. So, the Casa de Pilatos, what is it? Located in the old town of Seville, about 1.5 kilometres due north of the Plaza de España. The Casa de Pilatos is a privately owned residential palace that was predominantly built in the 15th and 16th centuries. Its fascinating blend of architectural and artistic styles make the Casa de Pilatos something of a snapshot into how Spanish society and culture were beginning to change in the 1500s. In spite of the palace's age, the first record of it being named Casa de Pilatos, which translates as Pontius Pilate's house, was in the mid-18th century in a record of property somewhere in Madrid. Seville was always at the forefront of Spain's exploration and colonisation of the Americas, and therefore, for right or for wrong, the city's merchant class and nobility were in pole position to benefit financially from everything that was going on in the Americas, the extensive mining of silver, that sort of thing. But while the discovery of the Americas and its resources helped fund the construction of places like the Casa de Pilatos, it was commercial ties to Renaissance Italy that arguably left the greatest cultural legacy on Casa de Pilatos and thereafter Seville and Spain more widely. Among the typical Mudejar Gothic influences of the medieval Andalusia, it is on this site where we see the first ever intentional application of Italian Renaissance design on a significant scale anywhere in Spain. This is a national first. The result is a truly unique place to visit that for some reason people are just not aware of. My very first trip was on Christmas Day 2020, during the time when the big nasty virus was around. We couldn't really do anything. I couldn't go back to see my parents that Christmas. It was quite miserable. I went to the Casa de Pilatos because it was open, and there were only 2 other people that day. Yes, admittedly, one of the biggest holidays of the year. Nevertheless, I think it's a travesty that people are not aware of it. So let's go. The entrance is lined with traditional Seville orange trees known as naranjos in Spanish. The entrance has whitewashed walls with peach-coloured archways on the first floor and green, dark grey green, coloured wrought iron railings over the windows and linings on the first floor balcony that you can see above the main entrance. You queue up, turn to the left as you go in and into the reception. The usual concessions are available for students, for seniors, for children, for organised visits, you name it. I pay €12 for general admission, but for an extra £6 you can get a guided tour of the rooms that make up the first floor, the upper floor of the house. There's plenty to see without it. I've actually never been onto the first floor myself because that is where the members of the House of Medici still reside. That is their home to this day, as I understand it. So, but you don't need to pay the full 18 to get an amazing visit. 12 for general admission is more than plenty. Behind the reception, the eyes shoot up to an oil painting of what the palace would have looked like at the height of its size when it stretched down to the San Esteban Church, which is down the road to the east of the Casa de Pilatos, and the San Leandro Convent, which is behind the house in a northwesterly direction. These buildings built at the site's height are still there, but some are now privately owned. So you pay, you get your ticket, you walk from the reception, you go left into the smaller courtyard. This was the stables once upon a time. So instead we turn right, we turn back on ourselves. You will see a wall in front of you with a single doorway in the middle. You walk through this door and come into what is the primary feature of the Casa de Pilatos, the main courtyard. This courtyard is the single feature of the palace that links all other sections, so it makes total sense for us to begin our visit right here. What I'm going to do now is we're going to focus on the visual elements of this courtyard. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll put up a bunch of beautiful photos now. If you're listening through any other podcast downloading app, by all means, open a little tab and do an image search of the Casa de Pilatos, and you will see the sumptuous details that I will be talking to you about in this section. After we have a look at some of the visual elements of this courtyard, I will be talking about the history of the house, because it is the courtyard that, in a way, tells the story of the house, and by proxy, the story of how the nobility of Andalusia were changing through the course of those couple centuries. A few things should stand out to you immediately. In the centre, right in front of you, we have a marble 2-tiered fountain spouting water from the centre. You can see on top of it a sculptured face on 2 sides, a bit like Professor Quirrell and Voldemort, if you're so inclined. As you look away from this fountain, you will see that all 4 sides of this courtyard are lined with archways with marble columns supporting the archways that are about 2.5 metres tall. That's me having a little guess. In each corner of this courtyard, the next thing you should see are huge, about 3 metre tall, I would say, maybe even taller, huge Renaissance style white marble statues, 1 in each corner, 1, 2, 3, 4. No painting on them whatsoever, and not even that much information given in by means of kind of information plaques next to them. The columns that we mention are also of marble, and the archways that link them all feature white carved plaster, white carved stucco, I think is the correct technical word. Each of these stucco designs has a repeated intricate geometric design with Arab script clearly visible in many places, and obviously intentionally so. The mind goes immediately to the Alcázar and the Alhambra as well in Granada. this is repeated on all four sides. You are surrounded by these sublime carvings, all topped by Corinthian-style capitals, which are also called ribbon capitals. Now, I didn't know this before doing this research. A capital is effectively the articulating element that sits between column and roof, or column and archway in this instance. Again, we see notable influence of the Renaissance in the choice of these type of capitals. Obviously, Corinth, being a former part of Greece, is nowhere near the Iberian Peninsula, so this was directly imported via the Renaissance Italians, and therefore we see here a clear attempt to copy classical Greek and Roman architecture in 15th and 16th century Spain, something that had never been done before. Above the white plaster stucco designs, we see a fence of stone, a railing, if you will, all around the courtyard. Gothic reliefs can be seen immediately, reminiscent of Northern European Gothic cathedrals. But from the side you entered, from the wall that separates the small courtyard from the main courtyard, there's nothing above. There's no building above this wall. But the other three sides, inside the main courtyard, do have buildings behind them, which are accessible through porticos, basically little corridors that are formed by these archways and columns. So you walk out of the main courtyard into these roofed galleys, these roofed corridors, black and white marble on the floor still. And then the next thing you'll notice at this stage is the tile work. And goodness gracious me, the artisan tiles that fill the Casa de Pilatos are probably the most photogenic thing about it. You won't notice them straight away when you walk into the courtyard with the abundance of things we just discussed, but they are sublime. There's blocks of about 1.5 to 2.5 meters, I would say, of the same tile design, generally with the coats of arms in the middle of the block, with all the coloured tiles all around it, surrounding it perfectly. And then the next block of 1.5 times 2.5 meters will have the same concept, but a different kind of tile around it and a different coat of arms inside the block. The presentation of colour and craftsmanship is just phenomenal. You can see from the photos, if you're watching on YouTube, it is unbelievably intricate, the work that's gone into this. The early modern era, so again the 16th century, coloured dyes were very expensive and difficult to mass produce. Therefore, large displays of artisanal tiles that are coloured, such as the one we have in front of us, were not the norm. This was a deliberate aesthetic choice to flex, basically, to show off, to be ostentatious, because that's what the nobility quite enjoyed doing. Of the three porticos in front of the rooms of the palace, the doorways into these rooms are lined with more white plaster, more white stucco. We see again the geometric carvings in these doorways, also reflected in the windows to these same rooms. The final thing you'll notice in this courtyard, as you walk through the porticos, as you walk through the galleys, above the blocks of coloured tiles, the walls have been finished with a peach-coloured paint, which is, I think, the same one that you first see on the outside of the building, the entrance as you're walking up to it. These peach-coloured walls do not have geometric designs built into them, as we have with the stuccos, the white plaster. They're relatively plain, but what is placed inside these peach walls is what draws the eye. We see, again, tiles of coats of arms placed between circular hollowed-out spaces in which there are white marble busts of people from antiquity. 24 in total. So all of the three walls of the main buildings that are linked to the courtyard have these concave, I don't know what you call them, hollowed out spaces into which one of these white marble busts of someone from history has been placed. 24 in total. And the final detail, dark golden tiles run around the circumference of these busts and connect them through the courtyard as you walk from portico to portico. So that's a good amount of visual detail, I think, to begin with. Let's start to look at the history. The history of the Casa de Pilatos, as we know it today, goes back to the pre-Columbian era. Obviously pre-Columbian, referring to the date in which Christopher Columbus made his clumsy discovery of the Americas in 1492. We're going to go back to 1483, when the combined kingdoms of Castile and Aragon were closing in on the final Muslim stronghold of the Nasrid dynasty in Granada. In the late 15th century, the religious pluralism and cultural sophistication that had come to define Al-Andalus in between more or less the 8th and 12th centuries had been replaced with an increasingly hardline Catholic orthodoxy. And here, in 1483, we can see traces of the Spanish Inquisition. The original owners of this real estate, of this site, not the house, but the actual ground it's built upon, were convicted of heresy. Now, I have struggled to find hard evidence about who these people were. I also couldn't find any description of the crime they had apparently committed. Nevertheless, the benefactors of this decision were the Adelantados Mayores de Andalucía. What an incredible title. Adelantados Mayores de Andalucía, Pedro Enriquez and Catalina de Ribera, who acquired this site and began to build their palace on it. Catalina, we'll start with her. The Ribera lineage originally comes from Galicia in northwestern Spain. Pedro de Ribera the Old, named Adelantado Mayor of Andalusia in 1396, is largely considered to be the founder of the Ribera lineage. And in the 15th century, the Ribera name rose to prominence due to the defence of the border against Granada. But Pedro de Ribera II died in 1454, leaving his wife with 4 underage daughters. Now, his widow was Maria de Mendoza. She was the Countess of Molares, so in her own right, someone from the nobility. She very smartly, in this situation, widowed with 4 daughters, betrothed her daughters to members of other noble families to ensure their status, rights, and legal protection independent of her going forward, as well as providing her daughters with the best education available to them at the time. This would have had a heavy focus on the humanities and also faith as well. But Maria also placed heavy emphasis on teaching her daughters the importance of honouring the Ribera family name and leaving a positive legacy. One of the men to whom Maria de Mendoza had betrothed a daughter was Pedro Enriquez de Quiñones. Born in 1435, he was the second son of an admiral of Castile and was distant related to Isabel and Ferdinand, the king and queen of Spain, at this point the people who had combined Castile and Aragon. Pedro Enriquez dutifully played his part in the defence of the kingdoms on the front line against Granada and had an active and fruitful military career. In 1460, he married one of Maria de Mendoza's daughters, Beatriz, but in 1475 he married her sister, another one of Maria's daughters, Catalina, which was, I guess, totally okay and not weird at all in the 15th century, but there we go, who am I to judge? 8 years later, the eviction of the heretic from the site allowed Pedro Enriquez and Catalina de Ribera to purchase the land from the royal treasury. Details of the transaction, like I said, are vague. I couldn't find a price or a description of the property at the time, but it was in this era, 1483 and 1505, that construction on the Casa de Pilatos, their medieval palace, began. And that time, the courtyard we were in was a U-shape. It didn't have the closing or fourth wall that separated it from the stables just yet. The coffered ceilings that line the 3 main galleries date back to the final decades of the 15th century, and these would have been seen by Catalina and Pedro themselves. A coffered ceiling has nothing to do with coffee. It refers to the varnished wooden ceilings decorated with an elaborate lattice geometric design in them and placed in the ceiling. The Casa de Pilatos has abundant coffered ceilings, which are beautiful. So what happened next? Pedro eventually died in 1492. On duty in Granada, the year in which Spain finally got rid of the Nasrid dynasty, and of course the year that Christopher Columbus first discovered the Americas. The widowed Catalina lived for 13 more years. She continued to have a fruitful life, and thus she played the primary role in the first stage of construction of the Casa de Pilatos. Therefore, most things we can see from the medieval era are a consequence of her direction and her decisions. Upon her death in 1505, she divided her enormous estate between her children, and it was her eldest son, Federico Enriquez de Ribera, who inherited the Casa de Pilatos. Born in 1476, just before his parents had acquired the site, Federico, the first Marquis of Tarifa, is responsible for the second phase of construction of the Casa de Pilatos, the era that most profoundly shaped it. Pedro, his father, had previously fathered a son with Beatriz called Francisco. He died in 1509 without an heir, so his entire estate was also inherited by Federico. This included the Palacio de las Dueñas, another early modern palace in Seville, all of his titles, and even a domestic monopoly on the sale of soap. By 1525, Federico's estate, therefore, was so massive that it was generating an annual income equivalent of his entire inheritance from his mother, Catalina de Ribera, upon her death in 1505. Federico, let's talk about him. He served in Granada Wars like his father had done, and in 1490 he was knighted, but it wasn't war or the military, but religion that had the far greater influence on his life. From the age of 10, he was a member of the Santiago Order. I'm not particularly familiar with this church, but he was very pious, and he acquired his mother's thirst for knowledge, in particular the humanities. In 1519, Federico undertook a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, something he described in his diary as the main event of his life, reaching the Holy City on the 4th of August that year, 1519. While the main motivation for this pilgrimage was devotional, contacts he made while crossing Italy during this pilgrimage would be what ultimately shaped the Casa de Pilatos and Andalusian architecture far more going forwards. Indeed, in the amazing city of Seville in the 16th and 17th century, fashion and design were directly influenced from Federico's decision to import Italian fashions at the time. Following his return to Seville on the 20th of October 1520, he was keen to utilise his contacts that he had made in Italy, in particular in Genoa and Naples, to bring Renaissance design to his palace. Unfortunately, he died in 1539 with no legitimate heir, and thus named his nephew Perafan, who had been named after the original person who founded the Iberian lineage in Seville. He was his successor. In his poor health and at the end of his life, Federico sold much of his assets to fund the Hospital de las Cinco Llagas, which was founded by his mother, Catalina. This building, apparently, is now the headquarters for the Junta de Andalusia, the Andalusian regional government. And so we turn back to the courtyard. What can we see here? That was the outcome of Federico's decisions. 1526 was the first time he changed the courtyard. He modified the types of capitals on top of the columns. Remember, the capital is the articulating element between column and roof. Inside this courtyard, he moved away from the Corinthian style and opted for a claw base and a bow style on the capital. Most Renaissance civilian courtyards thereafter mirrored this choice, I am told. Something he did that I found a bit more unsavoury. Of course, he was a Catholic, a devout Catholic, a pious man living in an era of absolute orthodoxy inside Spain. Of course, the Inquisition had just been founded. Heretics, Muslims, Jews had to convert or either be expelled from Spain or suffer really nasty things you don't want to suffer. He did not like the Mudejar motifs, the carvings in the white stucco, the white plaster, in particular those that contain the Arabic calligraphy. A lot of it is essentially praise of Allah, things that translate to the perpetual empire for Allah, eternal glory for Allah, that sort of thing. He decided to put up boards, tiled boards, to cover these motifs, this calligraphy. They're still there. Thankfully, he didn't destroy them, which is something other Christians in the era gladly did, but he covered them up so as to, I guess, demonstrate his virtuosity, his piety in his faith. However, he redeems himself with the introduction of that central fountain in the courtyard, the weird one with the double face in it, octagonal in shape, made of Carrara marble. The double face relief that you see on the top is of the Roman god Janus, and the fountain apparently was commissioned by Federico in Genoa in 1528. So 8 years after his return to Seville, he was still utilising his contacts to try and get as much of what he saw as the superior Italian art and design into Spain. Indeed, the Casa de Pilatos was the first location in Seville to use Renaissance marble for decorative purposes. And Federico and Perafan, who we shall discuss next, imported a bunch of this stuff. Perafan, who was he? The third construction phase of the house of the Casa de Pilatos was undertaken by Federico's nephew, Perafan de Ribera. He was another person with an incredible collection of official titles. He was the second Marquis of Tarifa. He was named the Viceroy of Catalonia in 1554. He was named the first Duke of Alcala and the Viceroy of Naples in 1558. And by the time he died in 1571, Perafan had risen to be one of the most prominent figures in Spain's 16th century aristocracy. These titles, they were for show. One of the purposes was quite simply to raise the right eyebrows in certain social circles in 16th century Spain, but they also did come with political and military responsibilities. It was expected that he would know what's going on inside the domains that he governed. One of those being Naples made him incredibly familiar with the movers and shakers in Italian design and art in the 16th century, and he exploited these contacts to the maximum to again further endow the Casa de Pilatos with the things that we're going to be seeing very, very shortly. His passion for classical antiques led him to create a collection of Greco-Roman sculptures that he wanted to exhibit in the Casa de Pilatos. These are the ones that are placed in the concave tondos at the top of the walls of the three buildings inside the courtyard. And in one case, Perafan bought an entire collection from a Neapolitan dealer by the name of Adrian Spadafora. Perafan suffered from gout for many years, grew ill in health, and died on the 2nd of April 1571, and his entire estate went to his brother Fernando. So, those busts, the 24 Roman busts that we see, who are they? They are figures from the world of the Roman Empire. As you can imagine, a bunch of them are emperors. We see Valerius, Vitellius, Lucius Verus, Antonius Pius, Caligula and Tiberius, two of the baddies, Maximus, Titus, Vespasian, Marcus Aurelius, and the two Roman emperors that were actually born in Seville, Trajan and Hadrian. Hadrian is one most likely familiar to any Brits because he was the one who commissioned Hadrian's Wall to keep out the rebellious Scots. Who else do we have? We have a few military figures from the Roman Empire. General Gaius Marius, General Marcus Agrippa, Scipio Africanus, and oddly, we have a bust of his arch nemesis, the famous villain of Rome, Hannibal. We also see a bust of the orator Cicero, Senator Quirinius, the ill-fated Mark Antony, and the mythical founder of ancient Rome, Romulus, after whom the final Roman emperor was ironically named. There is one name that I'm not familiar with. I don't know who this person is, Tudita. Whilst taking a look into this, I have found no information about this person, Tudita. No idea who that was, but must be someone of relatively high standing for them to have a bust in the Casa de Pilatos. There are a couple more. There's two more non-Roman outliers who have their own bust. One, Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, who the Romans idolised for his military achievements, let's put it that way. And then, a little bit prosaic, we see Charles V, also known as Carlos I in Spain, the man appointed Holy Roman Emperor in 1519 and one of the most powerful human beings in history. And without coincidence, he was a contemporary of Fadrique and Perafan. They would have known each other, and therefore it's kind of an inclusion of a bust of Charles V in this collection was probably politically beneficial to Fadrique and Perafan. So those are the 24 Roman busts. I also said there were 4 statues, 4 giant 3.5 metre tall statues located in each corner of the courtyard. One is of Faustina Minor, the wife of Marcus Aurelius. One is of an unnamed woman with a tambourine, and the other 2 are of Athena. But one is described as peaceful Athena, and the other is described as belligerent Athena. So one is prepared for battle, is ready for war. The other is in a state of peace. So we have looked at the courtyard. We've absorbed the incredible history. Let's take a walk into the house. The first place we have to begin, if you turn to your right, is the biggest room in the entire complex. More than 130 square metres, made in the 1530s by Federico Enriquez. This is called the Praetorium Hall. The first thing I think we probably noticed here, if you look up, you see, again, a golden coffered ceiling with squares decorated with gold-painted geometric designs and some shields in the centre of each of these squares. This is still the original coffered ceiling from 1530, almost 500 years old, and it's still there. It's incredible to look at and remarkable how well this has been maintained. As you look around, we see coats of arms that represent families from the Spanish aristocracy, the Mendoza family, the Quiñones family, the Figueroas, the Toledos, the Portocarrero families. This was Fadrique's way of paying tribute to them in the Praetorium Hall. The 5 rows inside the coffered ceiling apparently is a direct copy of what was fashionable in Italy at the time. Federico probably got the idea from Agrippa's Pantheon in Rome, but Mudejar lattice patterns between the shields clearly distinguished this coffered ceiling from anything that could be Italian from that era. Woodwork around the doors bear particularly delightful Mudejar geometric designs, through which we can see the Islamic and Jewish legacy in Andalusian design. Again, an amazing collection of artisan coloured tiles complete the walls with further incredible white carvings on the upper walls and doorways, which are also still the originals, and apparently these were made by the carpenter Andrés de Juana, who designed and oversaw the creation of the coffered ceiling and the plaster stucco carvings, mostly done between 1534 and 1539. So, room number 1, the Praetorium Hall. Room number 2, the Anticapilla, the pre-chapel room. One of the main rooms used by Pedro and Catalina during their stay inside the Casa de Pilatos. Inside it is what's called the Flagellation Chapel, which we'll get to in a second. This room, also referred to as the Salón de Descanso de los Jueces, the judges' resting room. This is the most colourful room that you're going to find in the entire estate. The first thing you'll see is furniture. We've got a few humble cushioned dark wooden chairs and a couple of tables on display in the middle of the rooms. And then above, you're going to see giant, perfectly round marble balls resting on top of these tables. Each one is probably about 30 centimetres in diameter, so God knows how much these must weigh. Each table is below a low-hanging dark lamp hanging from the ceiling. What you'll notice next is the plaster carvings, the stucco carvings. This is repeated on the tops of the walls, which have this as a sort of skirting. These are the most elaborate in the entire palace. But in the Anticapilla, we can clearly see Gothic influences as well. A change of direction from Mudejar architecture. Tall, straight, austere columns that curve inward at the top, with 3 holes representing the Holy Trinity before the point. As common to see in Gothic cathedrals, we see these in the stucco designs above the entrance to the Flagellation Chapel. We can see traces of Renaissance art here, floral reefs, incorporated plant shapes and forms, and even the occasional human vigour put into them. There is a coffered ceiling in this room. It's older, but I don't think it's quite as ornate or spectacular as that in the Praetorium Hall. And then we have the tiles. This collection here in this room is fantastic. One of the best displays of early modern ceramics anywhere in Spain. You're not going to find many things like this. At the beginning of the 16th century, a new tile manufacturing technique made it possible for the first time to insert curved lines. The way in which it was done is you apparently would carve the drawing in negative over the mould, then apply pressure to the fresh mud paving stone, which apparently would prevent colours mixing when the tile was cut. The potters Diego and Juan Palido from Triana, on the other side of the river, committed to some 2,000 tiles per week to the Marquis of Tarifa Federico. This room has the biggest and best remaining collection of this type of tile anywhere in Spain. Back to the wall, we see a concave room known as the Flagellation Chapel. We see a pink marble column on the floor, dead centre of the room. The first thing you'll see, very small. This is said to be a copy of the column of the flagellation of Jesus Christ, hence the name of the chapel. The walls inside this room are covered with white plasterwork. Again, the bottom third of the walls are covered with very handsome green and blue tiles. These are visibly older than those in the Anticapilla. And apart from that, we see a 3rd century AD statue of the good pastor carrying a sheep for sacrifice on the back of the Flagellation Chapel. This apparently was a gift from Pope Pius V to the first Duke of Alcalá, and beside it we can see 2 elaborate candlesticks, beneath 2 portraits and 1 large Renaissance painting. Continuing the tour, we'll move to the next room, which is Pilate's office. A doorway from the Anticapilla will take you to a smaller room with no exterior windows in an almost perfect square shape, but a small octagonal fountain in the middle of this floor. The walls again are beautifully coloured with tiles below a white carved stucco plaster along the top of the walls and the doorways. This room, Pilate's office, from which we get the name Casa de Pilatos, has, in my opinion, the best coffered ceiling in the entire palace. Look up right now. We see dark wood with gold touches. More Mudejar geometry. Again, we can see the influence from Islam and Judaism in this design, with golden 10-point stars dotted around the place that are equidistant from each other. Some larger stars protrude from the ceiling, and in the middle is a coffered vault known as the alfarje. For me, this gives the impression of a night sky with a full moon in the middle. I'm not sure that was the intention, but this is what I see when I look up at this unbelievable coffered ceiling. Pilot's office, this room, was what's known in Arabic as a kuba. Now, the Castilians, as they began to reconquer places that had been ruled by the Moors, by the Arabs for a long time, they took what they found useful and pleasant from the Islamic sites that they discovered. In the 13th, 14th, 15th century, more and more concepts from Islamic design, architecture, and art were incorporated into what became the predominant Spanish style of the late medieval era, the pre-modern era. Huba was basically a noble royal reception room, hence the small fountain of water that you see in the floor for hygiene. Again, a big central element of Islam is cleanliness and water management. At the back of Pilot's office, we see a small domestic room. What I like most about this particular room, I don't recall its name, is we see a painting of a bearded woman breastfeeding. This was done by José de Ribera in 1631, and it's called La Mujer Barbuda, the bearded woman. We move around once more, and we get to the final element of the main house that we're going to discuss, the stairwell. The first of its kind in Seville, built to deliberately impress any visitor to the site, used for ceremony, and as such its splendour and opulence trumps even that of the Praetorium Hall. We see a plain tiled floor, but more blocks of coloured tiles in groups with coats of arms put into the centre, with more white stucco carvings lining the top of the walls and the archways over doors, all the way onto the first floor. The big thing here is the coffered dome ceiling. This is unlike anything else in the palace. It's sumptuous dark gold, and just the scale of this thing is unbelievable. Apparently it was inspired by the Alcázar, but this dome beats whatever you find in the Alcázar hands down. Apparently there are only 4 vaults of this style and size in the world. 3 are in Spain, 1 apparently is in Peru, and that was made in 1973, so it does not have the same antiquity, and therefore it does not have the same charm. Another 10-point star you see in the centre of this coffered dome invokes a night sky, and the artistry here is next to nothing. So those are the main rooms. We're going to look at the gardens now very quickly before we conclude our tour. You walk down across the courtyard and you go back through the Praetorium Hall. As you look on the right-hand side, you will see a small door. Go through that and you will be on the east side of the palace in the small garden, the Jardín Chico. It's probably about 1,000 square metres overall. And there's a sheltered arcade, another galley, that you immediately come into after exiting the Praetorium Hall. And a bunch of Roman stone relics, probably from Italica, are placed all around here. Italica being a former Roman site located very close to Seville, I think about 7 kilometres away. Another amazing coffered ceiling overhead and wrought iron window grills next to you are very impressive. And here we can see cherubs lining the Enrique de Ribera coat of arms made by Pedro Delgado. They used to be 2 fully separate gardens, but they were joined to each other in the 20th century. The first half has fewer features, but you can see a few Greek-looking structures around the garden, high walls covered with what looks to me like ivy, but I'm not a plant expert, so behind this small building that splits the garden, you can see a raised rectangular pool lined with plant pots and a structure at the head of this pool looking back at us. This is a representation of Eros holding the bird. In 15th century Andalusia, water procurement was difficult. At the best of times, Spain has a problem getting hold of fresh water, but 500 years ago, it was even more of an acute problem. Therefore, having fresh water available in the Casa de Pilatos was another way that the owners could flex on their status in society. A Roman aqueduct in Seville brought water from the medieval town Carmona, a few kilometres away. This brought the water to the Alcázar. It was the crown who decided who had access to this fresh water source, and the Casa de Pilatos was one of the sites given access to the fresh water from this aqueduct. The other side of the small building has more shrubbery, bushes, trees placed at right angles to each other with baked earth underneath, allowing you to walk between them. The flowers and plants on display are more colourful on this side of the garden, and a small tiled section of the larger half of the garden has another small octagonal water fountain built deliberately into it that is again indicative of consistent adoption of Islamic design and architecture in early modern Andalusia. What is this room we keep talking about, known as the Golden Room? This small building is barely 30 square metres, but extremely striking in appearance. This is pure Italian Renaissance, what we see here. We have a tiled floor. We have sunflower yellow painted walls inside, pink marble columns flanking the doorway as you enter, and more white carved stucco lining the ceiling, the doorway, and the window frames. Another gold coffered ceiling, again with 5x5 little squares inside it. This was done by carpenter Cristobal Sanchez and is the youngest coffered ceiling in the entire Casa de Pilatos. The golden room and the adjacent hallway have some fantastic sculptures that were part of Federico's collection. The best one, we can see two complementing stone reliefs on either side of the wall facing each other from the 1st century AD that commemorate the victory of Augustus and his general Agrippa in 31 AD over the united forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. This marks the end, basically, of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Empire. The Golden Room was Federico's summer house. Because it was kind of jutting out into the garden, it was more connected to nature. On the east side, so deliberately facing the sun, of course, as well. He didn't get to enjoy it that much, however. A lot of the work on the Golden Room was done in 1539, the final year of Federico, the first Marquis of Tarifa's life. The final thing we'll discuss is the large garden. This is on the northwest side of the Casa de Pilatos. In the 1570s, under Pere Afán de Ribera, Federico's nephew, the palace was extended. Northwest of the main complex, more land was purchased. The large garden, occasionally referred to as the orchard, the huerto, is situated between the exterior wall of the Anticapilla and 3 younger buildings built onto the side of the palace. What a place to end our tour. From the early modern Andalusian fusion of Gothic, Romanesque and Mudejar architecture we've been enjoying so far, here in this garden we are immediately transported to Renaissance Tuscany. In the main garden we have squares of bushes with trees in the corners, a stone path between these islands of colour and the sweet scent of pollen all around. We've got a small octagonal marble fountain with typically Islamic gullies, again to channel water, a form of tiles around it to allow for the flow of water. White marble benches in a classical style also sit next to this fountain. We've got more Roman antiques collected by the previous owners surrounding these walls and rooms. The aesthetic of the 3 younger buildings that line the large garden were done by Pere Afán, were deliberately not Mudejar. He was trying something very different. The new palace, the building northwest of the house, on the northwestern side of the garden, has a plain fuchsia pink walls, topped with decorative ramparts. The other 2 buildings could have come straight from Pisa. We've got pale, peach-coloured plaster walls with Romanesque columns and archways, deliberately lacking the Mudejar focus, and with a distinctive high semi-spherical archway that is much more typical of Romanesque architecture and design. The various hues of pale yellows and pinks all around focus much more on harmony than intricacy, and into the 2 connecting buildings we see more Roman bust put into alcoves in the walls above the doorways. Pere Afán was trying to do something a bit different in this part of the site. It was trying to recreate the typical summer villa of the 16th century Italian nobility. What they would do is they would have suburban villas that with great views of the countryside that residents could enjoy. They had to subvert that idea slightly, obviously being in the middle of Seville. Pere Afán hired the Neapolitan architect Benvenuto Tortello, who arrived in Seville in 1568, and it was Benvenuto who said, we need to change this idea. So rather than having an open-style garden of a villa, they had it closed on all 4 sides, but retaining some of the design elements from those suburban villas in northern Italy during the Renaissance era. And this is the end of the tour. This is the end of our visit to the Casa de Pilatos. What happened after those 3 construction phases? The site fell out of favour for centuries. It was the mid-19th century when the 15th Duke of Medinaceli, Luis Fernández de Córdoba y Ponce de León, an incredibly long name, began to spend longer seasons in the Casa de Pilatos, and he committed to its renovation. It was his grandmother, in the 1850s and 60s, the Duchess of Denia Ángela Pérez de Barradas, who began working on the courtyard once again, starting with the courtyard, returning to 19th century design norms, which allowed for a more open plan and easier access to the courtyard. The black and white tiling that we see on the floor in the main courtyard was implemented at that time, instead of moving away from clay, and basically the courtyard is now as it was then. Who owns The Casa de Pilatos, it is owned by the Fundación Casa de Medinaceli, the same family that still owns it. This foundation seeks to preserve and promote the historical, cultural assets and monuments owned by the Casa de Medinaceli across all of Spain in an effort to provide a window into the history of the family as well as the locations of these assets. It is also to the foundation that I owe a huge thanks, as their website was a fundamental tool in conducting research for this podcast episode. Next time you go to Andalusia, you go to Seville, you've got one more thing that absolutely must be on your to-do list: the Casa de Pilatos. And that's the end of the episode. We finish with our regular segment, Spanish recommendation of the day. Today it is the book Ghosts of Spain, Travels Through a Country's Hidden Past by Giles Tremlett, one of the best non-fiction writing about Spain that I have ever had the pleasure of reading. If you want to understand the modern country, number 1, listen and subscribe to Hispanophiles podcast. Number 2, read that book. That's everything, guys. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. See you soon. Is